Hi, I'm David Robson, and I'm joined by Melissa Singh, who's 37 weeks pregnant, 37 weeks and 1 day pregnant, and Safire Naranjo, a registered midwife. And we're going to talk about Ashtanga and pregnancy, and if a person can practice Ashtanga Yoga while they're pregnant. So that's the first question. Who wants to answer?
Safire, would you like to go?
Yes, certainly. Any pregnant person can practice yoga through the duration of their pregnancy, provided that they feel comfortable doing so. So there's not necessarily one method that applies to all people. It really depends on how the pregnancy is going, how the person feels. Even from one pregnancy to the next, a person might find that they feel great in their first and were able to practice right up until the day they went into labor. And then with the next pregnancy, they feel like their body's doing different things and it's not, doesn't feel so great to practice. So I think ultimately it's up to the pregnant person to decide if and when and how the practice works for them.
So pregnancy generally wouldn't be contraindicated, but specific to each pregnancy, the person would have to decide then?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely not contraindicated. In fact, there's many physiological benefits to practice. As we know, it increases circulation and blood flow to the baby, the placenta, the brain. There's immune boosting effects. We know there's lots of great benefits.
So I always think of pregnancy yoga classes, when I think of a pregnancy yoga class, as a lot of lying around and props and deep breathing. But Ashtanga Yoga, you're jumping around, it's hot in the room. That kind of physical exertion is still safe for a pregnant person.
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends on where you're starting when you become pregnant. So if a person has never done yoga before and they're pregnant, probably that prenatal class where there's sort of gentle stretching and a lot of floor poses would be more appropriate. But a person like myself, for example, when I became pregnant, I'd had an established yoga practice for many years and I felt really comfortable and confident continuing on with my entire practice actually till pretty deep into it. And really just felt like I was listening to my body, taking it sort of day by day, and knew when it was appropriate to kind of scale back.
So it might not be the best time to start Ashtanga.
Probably not.
Yeah, but if you've already got an existing practice.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, you'd already been practicing before you got pregnant.
Yeah.
And you've practiced throughout, not in the first trimester though.
Yeah, so I was told by a doctor that I went to see who was not an OBGYN or a midwife that I should completely stay away from Ashtanga for the first 3 months. And then he actually said I should probably stay away from Ashtanga even afterwards, and I should just do restorative yoga. And that really frightened me because I had had a miscarriage in my first pregnancy. And so at the advice of that doctor who had said, you're really vulnerable in your first trimester, you shouldn't be, doing anything to jeopardize that. I got really afraid to practice, and so I stopped. But once I had, finished my first trimester and started working with a midwife, she was so upset that was the advice I was given, because she said, you could have been practicing throughout. Whether you were going to have a miscarriage or not has nothing to do with what you're doing in the first trimester. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen irrespective of your yoga practice. I also think that there's a lot of fear. There's this culture of fear around pregnancy and birth where women are afraid. There is this idea that things, you're really vulnerable in the first trimester. And maybe Safire could speak to that a little bit more and where that idea comes from. But it seems really pervasive. It was reinforced by my husband's parents, even by my parents. It was reinforced by friends who were like, oh my God, you're going to do. Even now, when I do a headstand, people are like, oh, isn't that really bad for the baby? And I'm like, it seems fine. But I don't know why that kind of myth exists that in the first trimester, you can't do anything.
Yeah, I think it probably stems from a place of fear. We do know that if a miscarriage is going to happen, it is most likely to happen in the first trimester. So I think there's a lot of caution that takes place around within the first trimester because of that. So, I mean, the advice that I give to my clients and other people who practice yoga is, you know, if the practice feels good to you, it's not going to cause a miscarriage. However, if you have a history of miscarriage and it makes you feel uncomfortable or more on a psychological level, it would feel sort of distressing to you to be practicing. And, you know, if you did end up with a miscarriage, you know, would you blame yourself? Those types of thoughts and feelings, and how that applies to that person. But if anything, there are benefits, right? Like to practicing through all the trimesters, including the first trimester. For myself, that was the only time of day where I felt good. So I felt super nauseous for the rest of the day, but I would wake up, I felt fine, I did my practice, and then it was the rest of the day that I felt unwell.
So we've established that it's okay to practice if you feel okay, Ashtanga during your pregnancy, during all phases of the pregnancy. But what has to change? Something must have to change. Full disclosure, I've never been pregnant in practice. So I have taught a lot of women that have been pregnant in my room. And I know from tradition, what I've been told, you know, that it's okay to drink water at that point and don't push, don't get too hot, you know, things like that. And then I know certain things like twisting. I was told to avoid letting a pregnant woman do deep twists and things like that. Things that maybe I've changed my mind a little bit on over the years. But you guys both have direct experience. So how did your own practices change during the pregnancy?
For myself, I've had 2 kids, so 2 pregnancies. The first, I actually felt great and did my entire practice, so intermediate and the first dozen or so poses of third series, and felt amazing and continued to do that till I was about 7 or 8 months pregnant.
I feel terrible if I'm not pregnant when I do that practice.
Yeah, I heard that, and then needed to sort of scale back. And then with my second pregnancy, I didn't feel good at all. I didn't practice very infrequently in the first trimester until the exhaustion sort of let up. And then I ended up doing a really modified intermediate. I couldn't do primary series at all. The forward bending didn't work for me.
Right.
But I did just a really modified intermediate for that pregnancy.
So modified in what sense? Specifically, I think people watching this, if they are pregnant, would be curious. What's modified? Because there's a lot of back bends on your stomach and things like that. I imagine you'd have to change that around. Yeah,
so for my first, I didn't. Amazingly, my body sort of kept that baby in and quite low, and I didn't need to adjust. Okay. But for my second, I didn't do those poses anymore.
You just skipped the ones that didn't feel good.
Yeah, so at a certain point, I mean, the uterus is tucked sort of within the pelvis. So the baby's well protected in the first trimester, so it wouldn't really impact that. But after 12 weeks, the fundus, or the top of the uterus, starts to grow 1 centimeter per week upward. And, by 20 or so weeks, I think I probably was off my tummy. But I did continue to do back bends pretty comfortably. And then ultimately, as you get bigger and bigger, you just run out of space. And a lot of the adjustments that you need to make in the practice are just based on not being able to fit anymore. For twists, for example, because I hear that a lot, it's not that something bad is going to happen to the baby or the placenta. It's just, ultimately, you can't fit. So you twist sort of the opposite way to open instead.
Well, that makes sense to me. But I think the way that it's delivered, that information sometimes, is that if you twist, you're going to twist your baby.
Thankfully, the human body is much wiser than that. And certainly a pregnancy is not so delicate that a simple twist could dislodge the baby or the placenta from the uterine wall or something.
Okay. What do you have to say?
I think that one of the best things that you told me in my practice when I first came back, I was like, so like, what should I do? And you were like, do whatever you want. And that was really empowering for me because I didn't feel like I had to do any one set of things, that I was able to just come in and show up and pay attention to my body and how I felt every day and let that be my guide, as opposed to this like rigid set of rules. And so for me, like I physically my legs would get wider and wider in, my Surya Namaskar or any other forward bending pose. But like Safire said, I just kind of was able to go through my practice, which ended up being like give or take primary minus a few. And I was able to skip the poses that no longer felt good when they stopped feeling good. And I think that was really important because I think in this lineage, like there's this idea that you have to do A, B, C. And there are days as practitioners, that we come in and we're like, oh, I have to do that whole thing. But when you're pregnant, you're like, oh, I can just show up and do kind of what I want, which is great. So it made me more likely to come and show up and do my practice and just like see what was going to happen.
I think the only rule was you're not allowed to eat.
Oh, I'm not allowed to eat. Yeah, I wanted those grapes that day.
Right,
yeah. And I like and the water and the window spot.
There's a special spot at our studio by the door, so we open it up just a little bit. It's the pregnancy spot, and you get some fresh air there.
It's great.
Because the rest of the studio is pretty hot.
Yeah.
But I guess as well, then you need cool air. You feel extra hot, right, when you're pregnant?
Yeah.
Yeah. There were days though, like there are some days when I'll come in and I kind of want the heat. Like some days I'm like, oh, I'm so hot, I need that door. But some days I kind of like the sweating because that's something I loved about the practice before. And maybe you could actually speak to this. Is it actually dangerous if you're too hot in your pregnancy, or is it fine and it's just uncomfortable?
Yeah, it's mostly that it's just uncomfortable. Like the body will cool itself down as needed. The baby's not going to overheat or whatever from too much sweating. Yeah.
Because that was another myth that I heard, was that if you get too hot, the baby's going to get too hot and die. I was like, oh my God.
No idea.
Yeah.
There is a drastic increase in blood volume, so increase in cardiac output and heart rate. So it's going to cause your pulse to go up. There's also blood pressure changes that can cause people to feel